In this week's project, we're going to be taking this 3D model situated within our Koger Theater, and we're going to be adding textures, and in a separate lessons, we're going to be adding resources from the resource browser and also some lighting to give our stage some lighting effects for a rendering. So first off, we're going to start with adding some texture. So if you watched the previous video, we talked about moving around in the space so you can see all the different parts, be able to manipulate the view in any way that you need to be able to see the different parts. So we're going to start with adding texture to the walls, and then we'll work on the doors and window, and there's some other little bits in here that we're going to add texture to as well. So let's just start with the walls. I'm going to go ahead and go into an OpenGL rendering mode so you can see the different shapes a little bit more. Now these walls were created using the wall tool in Vectorworks wall tools here. I made them the depth of a traditional Hollywood style flat, so they're 2 3/4 inches deep, but the width and the height are, what you would expect a wall to actually look like. So in order to add texture in a Vectorworks model, it needs to be three-dimensional. And since these wall tools here do create 3D tools, we're going to be able to add some texture to that. It's going to be a little bit different when we add texture to objects that were not made using the 3D tool sets from Vectorworks, but we'll get into how that's a little bit different in just a little bit. So let's start with the wall here. If I go over to my object info and look at my shape information, this obviously has the information about height, top and bottom, where it's placed on the stage, and so on. So there's in a wall, it's fairly, there's not a lot of things you can change about it. You can change the height, you can change its position, and so on. So what we need to do to add texture is to go over to this render tab over here, and you'll see some things come up by default when you look at the different 3D objects. And the first thing we're going to change is this class texture. And we're going to change that to texture. Class texture means there are some styles you can add to walls in here, and the walls that we're using are unstyled, so we're creating our own textures for those. Most of it has to do with what it looks like from a top view, and an unstyled wall just looks like a polygon from the top view. So we want to change this to texture. Now, from here, we're going to use the browser underneath. If you just click on that, whatever box pops up, it's going to bring up your texture browser. And if you look in Vectorworks, at the top of this scroll, you'll see your open files, and this is just going to show you for the files that we might have open. In particular, we're dealing with this Vectorworks rendering project, and there's a few textures already being used in this particular file, but in order to find more, you're going to look under your Vectorworks library. So if that's not already expanded, just expand that little caret and expand the other various folders in here, and you will see that there are tons and tons and tons of resources here for different textures and whatnot. Now, if you don't see these same textures in your Vectorworks libraries, chances are you did not download them. So if you click on this help button, if you're using a PC, it might be different, but where it's at least where you find the information. But if you go to help and then this download content, it should bring up a menu here that allows you to pick and choose what you want to install or download onto your computer. If you don't have a lot of space on your computer, if your computer is a little if it doesn't have a real fast processor, you might want to only install what you really need to. But generally speaking, you'll probably want some of these textures. You might want some of these architectural objects, furniture pieces. We don't use the metric system, so I wouldn't recommend downloading the metric sizes because it's pretty much copies of the imperial. But you can pick and choose what to download. It'll take a little bit of time depending on your internet speed and whatnot, but lots of different things that you can download, including gobos. Again, textures of fabrics, different things like that. Okay, so if you don't have the same set of things that I have, then you probably just need to download them. And honestly, it looks like there might be a bunch of new stuff that I haven't downloaded myself. So, so we'll see. Download what you like. All right, so going back to our little resource browser here for textures, you just really kind of go through finding things that might make sense for a wall. I am open to using different textures that may or may not be normal found on an interior wall, but I'll leave the actual textures that you use up to you, and we'll talk about how you can manipulate those to make it work for you. All right, so let's find. Oh, there were some brick textures that I really liked. Let's see if I can find those. I think this was the one. This was the one that I liked. Don't know exactly what puts these particular things into this menu, but you know, sometimes you just have to click around and find what you like. So there's some different sort of textures, not necessarily what you might find in inside of a house, but this is going to be a brick walled house, at least some of that is. So I'm going to choose this exposed alley brick. I like that one. Now I double clicked on it and you can see that it is set in here, but obviously there is no change in our wall. So with these wall objects, there's a couple of different things you need to do. So underneath the render dialog here, you'll see mode and part. So for this, it's going to be easier for you to just keep it by object. And then if we look at this drop-down box, we can see it says overall exposed alley brick. This was the texture that we chose. But all of these other parts, and these are the different parts of the wall itself. When we look at the different parts, the left side is what we would consider the offstage side of our walls, and the right is going to be the on-stage side. Probably has to do with just how it got drawn and how it was put on there. So that may change depending on the actual object. These other parts, start, cap, and is like the top and bottom, holes if there's a window in here. So if we wanted the texture to be applied to the sides of that wall, we would have to choose this. But for right now, let's just choose right, and we're going to click this revert to overall after we save. And when we click to revert to overall, well, that's interesting. That is not the texture I thought we were going to be picking. Well, okay. I'm going to pause and figure out where this went wrong. All right, well, I think that Vectorworks glitched because I did very few things and just clicked on a couple of different things, and our brick has come back to us. So frankly, Vectorworks glitches sometimes. It does things that we may never understand, but here we are back to the brick on our wall. So as you can see, it's tiled, which can sometimes be problematic if you're using a texture that doesn't have like a repeatable edge. It can sometimes be very obvious, so you have to be a little bit careful about that. But for the most part, you know, that texture shows up pretty well. A couple things to note on here. You do have some ways to change things up a little bit. This auto align plane is usually your best choice, but it's not always. Sometimes it's better to choose one of these other ones depending on what kind of object you have. So you can always try that out. And then scale is a good one. If I feel like that brick's a little bit too big, which I think it is, I can actually bring the scale down just a little bit, and you can see how it does make those bricks on there a little bit smaller. So there's a little bit of a line that becomes obvious because of the tiling, but it's not too bad. So I'm going to leave it alone. And then this offset horizontal, offset vertical, you can change where the seams are essentially. So if I just click in 0, you can see that it shifted those seams just a little bit. So sometimes there may be a situation where you have an image that's large enough to cover the whole object, but for whatever reason, Vectorworks puts a seam down the middle, so you can adjust those numbers to get the seam where you want it to be. Rotation is going to allow you to actually rotate the image, but for brick, you know, that's not going to make a whole lot of sense. So we're going to leave that at 0. But you may find a texture that you want to use that rotating that might be appropriate. Then, of course, you can, if you unselect some of these things, it's going to be a dire situation. So just be careful how you pick it. Flip horizontally is just literally going to flip it over and so on. This may make a difference if you have a like a highlight shadow situation going on in the texture that you use, so that may make a difference in the long run. All right, so from here we're just going to go about, and I think I'm going to make these 2 walls the same texture. So again, I can, if I have 2 of them, 2 objects that are similar, I can always apply the same texture to more than one. So if I go change that to texture, and again, whatever pops up is usually what is going to be applied. Usually it's the last texture that you used, and then we just need to go and check here. Let's change right, revert to overall, and you can see that it's applied those textures. So that one is you know, pretty straightforward, and again, you can make changes by changing that. Okay, so from here now, I'm going to just go about adding textures. It's a very similar process. I'm probably going to use the same textures on these 2 walls as I do on the other, just to keep it symmetrical. If you are interested in playing around with some different things, then by all means, you know, you can make each wall a different texture if you like. But I'm going to select all 4 of those and change that to texture. Let's just try this one. All right, so obviously it didn't make any changes, so we're going to try changing this right class, revert to overall, and let's see what happens. So that comes up. The tiling is pretty noticeable on here, so I'm going to actually enlarge the scale a bit. Some textures are more obvious than others when they're enlarged, so just be aware of that. But this is why, you know, Vectorworks renderings are useful in that you can get some nice visual imagery in here, but it's not usually the final thing that you want to have on there. I'm not real crazy about those colors with my brick. I like the brick, so I'm going to see if I can find something a little I'm not crazy about that one either, but I think we'll live with it for now. And then last, got these two walls. I think we'll go back to a brick, but maybe more of an exterior type brick on this one. This one's kind of nice. Again, doesn't show up because of the glass here. And those bricks look a little small, so I'm going to actually increase those. Okay, so let's look at our finished object here. You know, it'll do. It'll be fine. All right, so next we want to just go about creating textures for these other objects. We'll start with the floor. I think we'll do a nice floor texture. Now this floor is just an object that I created. It's a rectangle. I applied an extrude to at 1/4 inch, and so it is just sort of sitting, it's as if we like put a masonite type floor on the for the set. So I'm going to go look for maybe a wood texture. There's lots of different choices for wood. How does this one look? Oh, that's not too bad. Let's increase the scale. Okay, and then this piece. Now this piece is a well, I manipulated it some. It is made from the resource browser, but it's all individual little pieces. So if you really, really wanted to, you could double click on this shape, and once you're double clicked in there, you have, you can actually change each individual one of these little dentals. You can change the background. But right now it's just one object. So it should work if we just apply a texture to that. I think we'll keep this one simple and find that paint, and the almond finish on the paint is good. So you can see how that looks now. You can also add color to things by just using the color tools here. So just to show you that real quick. So if I click on this piece that I just added that almond texture to, change it back to none, I can add color here. And usually the color is not particularly subtle in the solids, but you can sometimes find something really, this kind of nice. If you just want a smooth texture, you don't want to add anything, any kind of like physical color changes or different texture to it, you can always add color through the attributes. But I do want you to try using the resource browser to find some of those things. And if I take something that I've applied a color to over here and add a texture on top of that, usually the texture overrides whatever color you might have put on there. So just be aware of that. I think these pieces, these little pieces of molding, I'm going to apply that same almond texture just to hold us all together. There it is. And I think that's that. This little bench down here, let's see if we can find a fabric texture to put on that one. Fabric. That looks interesting. And let's up the scale a little bit so you can see that bit of plaid on there. Now this is this map type perimeter was default selected. Let's see if we change auto align plane. So we choose auto align plane, and you can see how that makes it wrap around the corners a little bit better. A sphere, so that's going to do some funky things. So if that was a round object, sphere or cylinder might make more sense. But let's just go with auto align plane, because it's with the auto align plane, it's going to try to line things up appropriately as it crosses a corner. And then our bench here. So what we have on this is a couple of different objects. So we have the bench itself, and then there's two panels. Each panel has a sort of backing on it, and then each panel has a sort of molding on it. So you can apply 3 different textures if you liked, but we're going to keep it fairly similar. I think this would probably be a wooden bench, so let's see if we can find some nice wood textures. Maybe something a little bit different than the floor so it stands out. Maybe this one? This would probably be a good candidate for rotating. So I can rotate and I can type in, I know I would want it to rotate 90 degrees so that that texture is going across. And then these 2 panels, probably also going to be a wood texture, maybe not the same texture. I'm going to make those a lighter color. And again, probably need to rotate that one. And then these, I think I'll make them the same texture as the other molding. Oops. And again, so I don't have to go back and find where that was in that library since I've used it before. I can just go to my open files and it should be in here. There it is, Paint Almond. Okay, I think we are ready now to add texture to the doors and the windows. Now, in a separate video, I had to go through a process to make these doors and windows actually work for this project. So if you're curious, if you're interested, I hope you're curious and interested. Maybe you'll go and watch it. It's somewhat complicated, I won't lie about that, but just, you know, check it out because there's different rules applied for creating textures on actual door objects. And what I found was when I did my usual trick to make this work, it made my wall disappear. So that wasn't good. I needed to do a slight modification. So if you poke around this file in any exploratory way to find different objects, if you click just right, you'll find that there's actually a window object behind these individual objects here, and these individual objects are offset just enough so that they stick out in front of the door and window objects. So suffice it to say, if you're curious, go check that out. But at this point, applying texture to the doors and windows should be very similar to how we apply texture to, for example, the floor or this bench. So they're being looked at as basic 3D objects at this point. So we can go in, apply texture, and pick the texture that we want. I think I want it to match that bench to a certain extent. Again, I have the ability to change the mapping on here, and this was what was missing when I tried to change it to the door object. It was rather frustrating. So I just manipulated it so that you won't have to go through that like I did. And then we have, I think we'll make this this part of the door and these cross pieces. Now, in a real situation, the way the door is painted is not necessarily the same direction overall. If we wanted to add a texture that was really true to what a door texture might be, it would need to have more than this many objects. So just be aware of that. You should be able to, in OpenGL, if you click in the middle, actually it did select it. If you see that, there's a bit of a highlight around there. Now, if you're in wireframe and you try to click on that, that doesn't work. So just, be aware if your wireframe can't click on an object and select it. If you're in OpenGL, you can click in the middle and of a solid part of the object and select it. So I want that to, Buster, shush, shush. Let's go back to, I don't know if I'm going to like this, but yeah, we probably need to change the rotation of that. Yeah, that's a little weird. That's not necessarily what a door might look like in reality. In reality, it might all be the same, or the trim, maybe the trim should be painted instead of this wood panel. We'll make it match our almond trim of everything else. And then maybe this door and the background of the door need to be the same color. Let's go with that birch color. So with some lighting and whatnot, we'll be able to see that texture a little bit better. So go over here and do the same treatment on this door. All right, so I've got texture there. I'm going to do the same thing on my window. This is where you get to play interior designer and try to create something that you might put in the house. There's another little piece in there. All right, so if I kind of look around, I mean, that's kind of ugly, but you'll play with your textures and, do what you want. You can make an ugly house, you can make a fancy house, you can have a, style in mind that you want to try to emulate in there. But just play with the textures, add some different things, and see what you can come up with there.